IB Biology, Human Physiology Part 11 is the first of 3 parts covering neurons and synapses. In Human Physiology Part 11, Neurons and Synapses A, this movie, the focus will be on the structure of a nerve cell called a neuron. The neuron is the functional unit of the nervous system. But before examining neurons in high detail, we have some terms to define. The essential idea is neurons transmit the message, synapses modulate the message. Here is the first of 2 slides that provide an outline of all available movies for Topic 6, Human Physiology for SL and HL students. Use the outline to find the movie you need for review. This movie is focused here. Here is the second slide of the outline for all available movies for Topic 6, Human Physiology. The nervous system is composed of the brain and the spinal cord as the central nervous system, and the peripheral nerves comprise the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system sends signals to and receives signals from the peripheral nervous system. The signals or impulses, now listen carefully, move along the membrane of nerve cells, and the nerve cells are called neurons. Here are the first 2 IB syllabus statements. State that neurons transmit electrical impulses rapidly. Neurons transmit the message. Synapses modulate the message. This is the essential idea. Here is a micrograph of neurons. Neurons are special cells that transmit electrical impulses rapidly along their cell membrane. The branched nature of neurons, a feature you can see in this micrograph, allows for connections with other cells. The impulses and the connections serve the role of communication between distant parts of the body. As well, neurons tend to be long, slender cells, again for facilitating communication between distant parts of the body. Before we examine the structure of a neuron, let's define some terms. The nervous system and the endocrine system, the hormonal system, along with many other body systems, are important for maintaining homeostasis. Homeostasis is the maintenance of steady internal conditions despite fluctuations in the external conditions, the conditions in the environment. And homeostasis is typically achieved through negative feedback mechanisms. Negative feedback is defined as when a system changes in one direction, a mechanism within the system reverses the change. For example, you mistakenly pick up a hot frying pan, setting up an imbalance as the heat of the pan is beginning to burn you. The hot pan is the stimulus. A receptor cell detects the change in the temperature of your skin and sends a signal, an impulse, toward the brain or the spinal cord, the central nervous system. The brain sends a signal to an effector, which would be a muscle or a gland. In this case, the muscles in your arm and your hand let go of the frying pan, and balance is reestablished by negative feedback, where a mechanism in the system reversed the initial change. Here are 3 IB syllabus statements that you should be able to handle. Define homeostasis, define negative feedback, and state that the nervous system and the endocrine system are both involved in homeostasis. Here's another example of homeostasis being maintained by negative feedback mechanisms. The example focuses on body temperature. Let's start here. The body experiences warming. That's the stimulus. Warm temperatures at the skin. Signals to the brain result in dilated blood vessels to give off heat or sweating. Both of these responses serve as negative feedback mechanisms to decrease body temperature. A decrease in body temperature results in signals to the brain, signals that indicate cold temperatures at the skin. The cooler body temperatures here result in negative feedback mechanisms of reduced sweating or constricted blood vessels, keeping heat in, or shivering, all of which serve to increase body temperature, returning the system to homeostasis. Homeostasis involves monitoring levels of variables in the body and correcting the changes in those levels by negative feedback mechanisms. The nervous system, particularly the central nervous system, monitors levels of variables like body temperature. Negative feedback mechanisms return the body to balance, maintaining a steady internal state. The house is dark. There is a creaking sound and the door moves slightly. There are stimuli being detected by your senses. There is an imbalance, a threat. Signals, impulses are sent along afferent neurons toward the central nervous system, toward the brain particularly. The brain processes the information and sends signals, impulses, along efferent neurons to effectors, muscles or glands that result in an increase in your heart rate, dilation of your pupils, cause you to move. You jump and flip on the lights. The response of the effectors, your muscles and glands, has allowed you to see a cat behind the door. The system returns to balance, homeostasis. Many aspects of physiology, the functioning of the body, are maintained in a homeostatic condition by negative feedback. Homeostasis involves maintaining the internal environment at a constant level or between narrow limits, and that includes blood pH, carbon dioxide concentration in the blood glucose concentration, body temperature, and water balance. When a body parameter, such as blood CO2 or blood glucose or blood pH or body temperature or water balance, is measured over time, displaying an oscillating curve such as this one, we have evidence of homeostasis and we have evidence of negative feedback. As the system changes in one direction, negative feedback mechanisms return the system to equilibrium, balance. As the system changes in this direction, negative feedback mechanisms return the system to equilibrium, balance, and so on over time. Now let's look at a nerve cell, also called a neuron. You can see one here in this image. These branches are called dendrites. The branches facilitate communication with other cells that you can see here in light blue. The long extension of the cell is called the axon. The extended axon facilitates communication with distant cells in the body. The swollen region with the nucleus is called the cell body. Now, synapses seen here are connections with other cells. A small gap lies between the two neurons, and the gap is called a synapse. We'll look at synapses in neurons part C. Now, the signal of a neuron, the impulse, is propagated along the membrane from the dendrite along the cell body to the axon, to the end of the axon, which we can't see here. Now, the axon is covered in a fatty sheath called a myelin sheath. That's seen here, and there are periodic gaps in the sheath called nodes of Ranvier. In this diagram of a neuron, the red arrows display the direction of signal or impulse propagation along the cell membrane from the dendrites, along the cell body, and along the axon to the axon terminals where this neuron would synapse with another neuron or synapse with an effector, a muscle or gland. You can see the myelin sheath around the axon, and you can see the gaps known as nodes of Ranvier. So based on what I've shown you already, can you annotate a diagram of the structure of a neuron, including dendrites, the cell body with a nucleus, an elongated axon, myelin sheath, nodes of Ranvier, and motor end plates? That's where the synapse occurs with effector cells such as muscles or glands. Here is another diagram of a neuron. The signal is propagated along the membrane from the dendrites, along the cell body, and along the axon to the axon terminals here. The myelin sheath and the nodes of Ranvier can be seen. Here's a chance to practice. Can you identify the parts of the neuron associated with each letter? Turn the movie off now, or follow along with me. A is a dendrite. B is the nucleus of the cell body. C is the myelin sheath. D is a node of Ranvier. E is the axon that extends away from the cell body towards F, which would be the axon terminals. This is where the cell would synapse with another neuron or an effector. Here is one more look at the structures that comprise a neuron, but this diagram has more information related to synapses. As you know, the propagation of an impulse proceeds from the dendrites to the cell body to the axon terminal. You can see the direction of propagation shown here. There is a synapse between the upstream neuron, what's called the presynaptic neuron, and the dendrites of the neuron featured in this diagram. As well, there's a synapse between this neuron and the dendrites of the next neuron downstream. This is called the postsynaptic neuron. Now, it's important to note that neurons transmit these electrical impulses rapidly, and the myelin sheath with its nodes of Ranvier allow for very fast propagation. The impulse jumps between nodes. You can see the jumping of the impulse along the membrane in the diagram. This is called saltatory conduction. Right here, saltatory conduction. I will explain a bit more of how saltatory conduction works in Neurons and Synapses B. Here is a micrograph that's a beautiful image of an axon at the node of Ranvier. The axon runs left to right through here. This is the myelin sheath on either side of the gap. This is the node of Ranvier here. The impulse, which arrives from a synapse with an adjacent neuron, propagates along the membrane from the dendrite to the cell body, and then jumps from node to node to node to node along the myelinated axon. Neurons transmit electrical impulses rapidly, some impulses reaching speeds of 100 to 200 meters per second. You have probably noticed in previous slides that the myelin sheath has had a second name, the Schwann cell. Here in this diagram, you see a Schwann cell beginning to wrap around an axon. The Schwann cell wrapped around the axon is what we call the myelin sheath. Here you can see how the Schwann cell has wrapped repeatedly around the axon. The fatty acid nature of a phospholipid membrane means that the axon is actually wrapped in a lot of nonpolar fatty material, otherwise known as the myelin sheath. If you understood the diagram on the last slide, you can make sense of this micrograph. The axon is here. The Schwann cell is wrapped tightly around the axon, and the Schwann cell membrane is here. This is the nucleus of the Schwann cell. Here is another micrograph of an axon wrapped tightly by a Schwann cell, aka the myelin sheath. The relevant IB syllabus statement is, describe how the myelination of nerve fibers, nerve cells, allows for saltatory conduction. This allows the impulse to travel rapidly along the membrane of the neuron. Remember, the myelin sheath, seen here, allows the impulse to jump rapidly down the axon from node to node to node to node. If you look closely, the impulse is described as a depolarization event, and you might guess that the depolarization of the membrane is the basis of the impulse, and it is. And with the Schwann cells, the depolarization happens at the nodes of Ranvier only. That's why the impulse jumps from node to node. More on the nature of the impulse as a depolarization event in Neurons and Synapses B, the next movie. This is a micrograph showing neurons forming synapses with muscle. Now, I've mentioned repeatedly that neurons synapse with other neurons and that neurons synapse with muscles known as effectors. The synapses with muscles stimulate a change in the position of the body to maintain homeostasis. Let me end this movie right where I started it. A change in the environment, a stimulus, is detected by a sensory neuron, and a signal, an impulse, is propagated to the central nervous system. The sensory neuron synapses with a neuron in the central nervous system. The neuron in the central nervous system synapses with a motor neuron that sends a signal, an impulse, to the effector, a muscle or a gland, for the response to the initial stimulus. Synapses are junctions between neurons and between neurons and effector cells. You accidentally make contact with a sharp object. The stimulus results in a signal, an impulse being propagated to the central nervous system by a sensory neuron. The sensory neuron synapses with a neuron in the central nervous system. The neuron in the central nervous system synapses with a neuron that sends a signal along a motor neuron to the effector, muscle or gland. The response to the stimulus maintains homeostasis by reducing or lessening the injury. And that brings us to the end of IB Bio Topic 6, Human Physiology, Part 11, Neurons and Synapses, A.